If you farmed in Britain after the war, the chances are you drove a David Brown, the white and red tractor that turned the soil from Yorkshire to the far side of the world. At its peak, the Meltham works employed nearly 4,000 people, sold through 2,500 agents in 100 countries, and built one of the great tractor marques of Britain. They survived the loss of Harry Ferguson, survived the Luftwaffe, hidden in their wooded valley, survived everything the century could throw at a great engineering firm, and then, after nearly 50 years of building tractors in that valley, the Meltham works fell silent. It didn't die slowly, the way you'd expect, and the tractors were as good on the last day as the first, and the order books were full, but it was destroyed anyway, in a single stroke, by something that no one in that valley ever saw coming. What reached into the home valley and took it all away? Chapter 1. The Boy in the Park. Every great Yorkshire engineering story begins with something small, made by hand, by someone who couldn't quite leave a problem alone. This one begins with wood, not iron, not steel. Wood, carved patterns, shaped to a hair's breadth by men who'd served 7-year apprenticeships, used to cast the gears that turned the machines that built the modern world. In 1860, in Huddersfield, a man called David Brown set himself up as a pattern maker. To picture the world he worked in, picture the West riding at full tilt, a county where the valleys ran black with mill smoke, where the railways were still new enough to feel like magic, and where a man with a skill in his hands could build something that outlived him. Brown cut gear wheel patterns for the foundries around him, and he was good at it. By 1873, he'd narrowed his focus to gear systems. By 1898, nearly 40 years in, the firm had become one of the first in Britain to specialise in machine-cut gears. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. A gear cut by machine ran quieter, stronger, and truer than anything a man could file by hand, and the world was filling up fast with machines that needed exactly that: looms, lifts, motor cars, ships. In 1902, the company moved to a site on the edge of town called Park Works. It's still there today, more than a century later, and everything that followed, the tractors, the tanks, the sports cars that James Bond would one day drive, grew out of that one stubborn obsession with making a wheel turn smoothly against another wheel. When the founder died, around the turn of the century, his sons Percy and Frank took the business on. They were ambitious men, and they pushed the firm forward. Complete gear units now, and the machines to cut them, and bearings, shafts, worm drives. The company was prospering, and it was into this family, onto this exact patch of Huddersfield ground, that the man who would build the empire was born. His name, too, was David Brown, the grandson. Born on the 10th of May 1904 at Park Cottage, a house that stood inside the 17-acre Park Works site. He wasn't born near the works, or in the town the works supported. He was born within its walls. The first sound he ever heard, in all likelihood, was the low hum of his own family's machinery, carried across the yard. His father was Francis Edwin Brown, Frank, a director of the firm, and, in his own right, a real pioneer of machine-cut gearing. His mother was Caroline, born a Brooke, and she was no ordinary Edwardian mother. She was, by repute, the first woman to drive a motor car in Huddersfield, and possibly the second in the whole of Yorkshire. In an age when most women never sat behind a wheel in their lives, young David's mother was out on the roads, hands on the controls. The boy came by his love of machinery honestly, and from both sides of the family. But the moment that tells you who he would become came when he was very small. The firm, restless as ever, had branched into building its own motor cars, odd little two-stroke machines they called valveless, made between 1908 and 1915. And the engineer who tested them was a man named Frederick Tasker Burgess. Burgess would later help design the engine of the 3-litre Bentley, one of the most celebrated cars of the 1920s. But in those years he was simply the works test driver, and he'd take the founder's grandson out on the runs, the little boy perched beside him on a wooden soapbox seat. Burgess taught him to drive. The child's legs were too short to reach the pedals, so they bolted blocks of wood to the controls to bring them up to his feet. A boy who learned to drive before he learned his times tables, taught by a man who would build a Bentley. That was the world David Brown grew up inside. He went to King James's Grammar School in Almondbury, then on to Rossall School over the border in Lancashire, where, in a detail that says everything about him, he bought shares out of his pocket money. Most boys spent their allowance on sweets. This one was quietly building a portfolio. You'd expect the heir to such a firm to walk straight into a comfortable office. He did the opposite. In 1921, aged just 17, he started at the very bottom, as an apprentice on his own family's shop floor. And he didn't arrive in any chauffeured car. He cycled 6 miles each morning to be at the gates by 7:30, the same as every other apprentice lad, his breath fogging in the cold air coming off the Pennines. He learned the trade from the metal up, the shop floor first, then foreman, then assistant works manager. He came to understand the business not from a balance sheet, but from the feel of a cutting tool biting into steel and the sharp smell of hot swarf curling off the lathe. He had a restless, mechanical mind that simply would not switch off. In his spare time, he designed and built his own motorcar. He called it the Daybro, working on it in his bedroom, and, when the parts grew too large, down in the company foundry after hours. It carried on until his father caught him at it during company time and put a stop to the whole enterprise. The future industrialist, sneaking the firm's machines to build a car of his own, ticked off by his own dad for the trouble. Then came the moment that handed him the controls for real. In 1931, his uncle Percy died, and David Brown, at just 27, became managing director. 2 years later, when the joint managing director W.S. Rowe died as well, he took sole command of the entire firm. He was not yet 30, and he ran the lot. He governed by a single principle, one he'd repeat for the rest of his life. Get a good man, and let him get on with it. If he is no good, get another man. But if he is good, support him. It's a plain creed, the kind of thing that fits on the back of a wage packet, but it built one of the great British engineering firms of the 20th century, and it shaped a culture at Huddersfield that lasted for decades. Find brilliant people, trust them, leave them be. And he was, in every fibre, an adventurer. In time, he'd become a polo player, good enough that a club still competes for a trophy in his name, a joint master of foxhounds, a racehorse breeder whose horse Linwell would one day win the Cheltenham Gold Cup, and a qualified pilot with his own private airfield at Crosland Moor and his own aeroplane. The man could not sit still, but all of that lay ahead. Because in the middle of the 1930s, David Brown's restless mind landed on a single problem that would change British farming forever, and it arrived in the shape of a difficult, brilliant Irishman. Chapter 2. The Irishman and the Handshake. By the mid-1930s, David Brown had bought himself a farm, and a man who runs a gear works and works his own land spends a great deal of time thinking about one machine above all others, the tractor. In 1936, he went into partnership with Harry Ferguson. Ferguson was a genius. There's no other word that fits. An Ulsterman with a mechanic's hands and an inventor's absolute certainty. He had cracked something nobody had quite solved before: how to make a tractor and its implements behave as a single machine rather than two things lashed together. His system used hydraulics to raise and lower a plough and a clever arrangement of 3 converging links to hold it, so that the drag of the soil pressed the tractor's rear wheels down into the ground for grip, instead of levering the whole machine over backwards. And that mattered more than it sounds. Earlier tractors had a lethal habit: hit a buried root or a heavy furrow, and the front end would rear up and flip, crushing the man at the wheel. Ferguson's linkage didn't just work better, it stopped killing farmers. It was elegant, it was safe, and it was, frankly, the future of agriculture. What Ferguson didn't have was anyone who could build it properly, at quality, at scale. What David Brown had was a world-class gearworks and an engineer's instinct for turning an idea into a thing you could sell by the thousand. So the two men joined forces, and in a corner of the Park Gearworks in Huddersfield, they began to build the Ferguson-Brown tractor. It was a landmark machine, the world's first production tractor with hydraulic lift and that converging 3-point linkage, a design concept so good that, within a single generation, very nearly every tractor on Earth would copy it. The first 350 or so used a bought-in Coventry Climax engine. The later ones used an engine of David Brown's own design. In all, around 1,350 were built. It should have been the beginning of a beautiful partnership. It became the opposite, because Ferguson's brilliance came welded to his temperament. He was mercurial and unbending, convinced he was right in every particular, and a hard man to share a workshop with, and none of that sat easily with the steady, methodical Yorkshireman. There was a deeper fault line too. Brown had studied the tractor he was building with a cold engineer's eye, and concluded It could be better. It could be made more cheaply. It could be improved. Ferguson didn't want it improved. He wanted it built precisely as he had drawn it, down to the last bolt. So David Brown did something that tells you everything about his nerve. He began designing his own tractor, in secret. He gave it a code name, VK1, Vehicle, Agricultural, Kerosene. While the partnership with Ferguson still officially held, Brown's own people were quietly drawing up a machine that would make Ferguson unnecessary. It was a gamble of real magnitude, and it's worth being clear-eyed about the risk. He was walking away from the most advanced tractor in the world, built alongside its own inventor, on a bet that he could do better entirely on his own. Get it wrong, and he'd have thrown away the best agricultural idea of the century to chase his own pride. The reveal came at the Royal Show in 1939. Brown unveiled the VK1, and that, there and then, was the end of the partnership. Ferguson did not take it lying down. He sailed for America, where he struck his own legendary bargain with Henry Ford, the famous handshake agreement, sealed on nothing but a gentleman's word, that would put Ferguson's system into Ford tractors by the hundreds of thousands across the Atlantic. Two extraordinary men who had built something remarkable together, walking off in opposite directions across an ocean, one to Detroit, one to a hidden Pennine Valley. And David Brown's gamble paid off handsomely. The VK1 was an immediate success. More than 7,700 of them would eventually be sold, a stunning figure for a brand new machine from a firm that, only a few years earlier, had made gears and nothing else. The boy who'd built a car in his bedroom had just built a tractor that the whole country wanted. But to build them at the scale the orders demanded, he needed somewhere far bigger than a corner of the gearworks, and he found it in a valley a few miles away, a place whose name would become inseparable from his own. A former silk and cotton mill deep in the home valley that had belonged to the Brooke family's firm, Jonas Brooke and Brothers. The family had moved on. The great stone buildings stood waiting beside the river. The place was called Meltham Mills. From 1939, it became the home of David Brown tractor production. A small Pennine village, wrapped in steep woods, was about to become one of the most important industrial sites in Britain, and almost the very moment the tractors began rolling out of Meltham, the world went to war. Chapter 3. The Valley that Hid from the Bombers. When the war came, a gearworks became one of the most valuable things a country could possibly own, because almost everything that wins a modern war turns on gears. The supercharger in a fighter's engine, the transmission in a tank, the drivetrain of a warship. And David Brown's firm, Park Works, the foundry at Penistone, and now Meltham, could cut gears better than almost anyone in the land. So the works did two jobs at once, and it's worth taking them in turn, because each one was its own kind of victory. The first was simply to keep feeding Britain. A nation under blockade, with the merchant convoys being torn apart in the Atlantic, suddenly needed every acre of its own soil turned over and planted. The ministry's slogan was everywhere: dig, plough, grow. And the tractor that did so much of that ploughing was the David Brown. Through the war years, even as materials were rationed and skilled men were called up, Meltham kept the agricultural machines coming, because a tractor in a Lincolnshire field was as much a weapon as a shell in a gun. It was an unglamorous, relentless contribution, and it never stopped. The second job was the war itself, and here the scale of what one Yorkshire firm achieved is almost hard to credit. They made over 500,000 gears for aero engines, for the Rolls-Royce Merlin and the Bristol Hercules. 500,000. The Merlin was the engine of the Spitfire, the Hurricane and the Lancaster, and David Brown's gears were turning inside them in the skies over southern England in 1940 and over Germany in the years that followed. They built more than 10,000 tank transmissions, and here the story turns on a single brilliant idea, patented back in 1935. A few years before the war, David Brown's engineers, working with Henry Merritt of the Woolwich Arsenal, had devised something called the Merritt-Brown-controlled differential steering system. It was a way of steering a tank by using its gears to drive one track faster than the other, smoothly and under power, instead of crudely slamming a brake on one side. It transformed the way a British tank handled, and it went into the great armoured beasts of the war in the years after: the Churchill, the Centurion, the Conqueror, and the monstrous 68-ton Tortoise. When a Churchill slewed round under fire to face the enemy, it did so on a system born in Huddersfield. Nor was that the end of it. The foundry at Penistone, opened in 1935, poured armour plating for the Churchill and the Cromwell, cast the steel casings for the enormous blockbuster bombs, and, in one of the war's most extraordinary feats of engineering, cast cabling for Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean that pumped fuel beneath the channel to keep the armies supplied after D-Day. Meltham itself even built aircraft tugs for the RAF, the squat little machines that hauled fighters and bombers around the airfields in all weathers. A valley full of tractor builders had become, almost overnight, one of the arsenals of a nation fighting for its survival, which made it a target. The Luftwaffe knew perfectly well what places like Meltham were producing, and a works turning out tank steering gear and Merlin components was precisely the sort of thing the bombers came hunting for. This was the gravest threat the company had ever faced. Not a rival, not a slump in the market, but obliteration from the air. A single accurate raid could have ended everything in a night. And here, the valley itself fought back. Meltham Mills sat deep in a fold of heavily wooded country, hard to pick out from above and harder still to bomb with any accuracy. The firm pressed that natural advantage for all it was worth. They camouflaged the works. They built mock wooden buildings out on a nearby moor, decoy factories, dummy halls, set up deliberately to draw the bombers away from the real one tucked down among the trees. And it worked, the propaganda broadcaster known as Lord Haw-Haw beaming his sneering bulletins into British homes from Berlin. Twice announced to the nation that Meltham Mills had been destroyed. Twice he was wrong. The works was still standing, still humming, still cutting gears for Spitfires and steering systems for Churchill tanks, hidden in its green Pennine Valley, while the man on the wireless told the country it was rubble. By the time the war ended in 1945, David Brown's firm had proved something about itself that no peacetime success ever could. It had faced a threat to its very existence and survived by outthinking the enemy. It had supplied the engines that won the air war and the tanks that won the ground war, from the products of its own benches, and it had done all of it while keeping the tractors coming, so that the moment peace returned, it was perfectly placed to do what it did best. David Brown was now in his early 40s. He had inherited a gearworks and turned it into something that helped win a war. He had a tractor the country wanted, a factory in a hidden valley, and a workforce of Yorkshire engineers who could make very nearly anything you put in front of them. The hardest part, you'd have thought, was behind him. In truth, the empire had barely begun, because the man who'd built a car in his bedroom was about to do something no tractor manufacturer on earth had ever done, and a chance advertisement in the pages of the Times was about to hand him the most famous name in motoring. The white and red machines that would fill British fields for a generation were coming, and so, astonishingly, was a sports car called Aston Martin. All of that belonged to the peace, and the peace was about to make David Brown a legend. Chapter 4. The Advertisement in the Times. In late 1946, with the war won and Britain settling uneasily into its grey, rationed peace, David Brown was reading the classified advertisements in the Times, and one of them caught his eye. A high-class motor business was for sale. It was Aston Martin. He went to look. He drove the cars, and in February 1947, he bought the whole concern for £20,500, a sum he could have lost without it troubling the gearworks much at all. But the purchase, on its own, didn't yet make the legend. The car he'd bought had a fine chassis and no great engine to put in it, and a sports car without an engine is a beautiful argument going nowhere. So the following year, Brown went looking for the missing piece, and he found it in another fallen name, Lagonda. He bought Lagonda in 1948 for £52,500, more than twice what he'd paid for Aston Martin itself, and he bought it for one reason above all. Lagonda came with a magnificent twin-cam six-cylinder engine, and that engine had been designed by none other than W.O. Bentley, the greatest British engine man of his generation. Brown married the Bentley-designed six to the Aston Martin chassis, and out of that union came a line of cars that bore on their bonnets his own initials: DB, David Brown, the DB1, the DB2, the DB3, the DB4, and then, most famously of all, the DB5, which became, after a film studio bolted machine guns and an ejector seat to a prototype and handed the keys to James Bond in Goldfinger in 1964, the most famous car in the world. There is a delicious irony buried in all this, and it's worth knowing. For all that his initials adorned the most glamorous sports cars on earth, David Brown's own personal motor car was a rival Jaguar. The man who built the dream drove something else to work. But here is the detail that ties the whole story together, the one most people never learn. The Aston Martin engines were designed and built at Meltham. The same valley, the same skilled hands, the same Yorkshire engineering culture that turned out tractors for the fields also turned out the power units for the cars of fantasy. The chief engineer of the tractor division oversaw the cars as well. So when you picture the DB5 sliding through the streets of Geneva on the silver screen, understand that its heart was forged in the same Pennine works where, a few hundred yards away, other men were building machines to plough the soil of Lincolnshire. One man, one family firm, leading the world, at the very same moment, in both the most humble of machines and the most exotic. That was the scale of what David Brown had become. But the cars, glamorous as they were never the heart of the empire. The cars, in truth, mostly lost money, kept afloat by the engineering divisions that actually paid the bills. The real story, the one that fed families across half of Yorkshire and filled the fields of 100 countries, was the tractors, and the tractors were about to enter their golden age. Chapter 5. Orchid White and Poppy Red. To understand what Meltham was at its height, you have to walk in through the gates on an ordinary working morning. The works hooter would sound across the home valley, the sound bouncing off the wooded slopes, and from the terraced streets of Meltham and the villages strung along the tops. The men would come, on foot, on bicycles, the steady human tide that an industrial town runs on. They clocked in, and then they walked into one of the most complete engineering operations in the country, where a tractor was not assembled from bought-in parts, but very nearly made, from the raw metal up, the way David Brown himself had learned the trade. Follow the work as it moved through the place, and you follow the whole genius of the firm. It began, as everything at David Brown began, with the gears. In the machine shops, the great gear-cutting machines turned, throwing off fine blue spirals of swarf and the sharp, oily smell that got into a man's clothes and never quite left them. This was a gear company that built tractors, and it showed in every transmission that left the place. The gearboxes were simply the best in the business, and the men who cut them knew it, could feel a tooth profile that was right, could hear when a hob was cutting clean. The gears went away to be hardened and ground until they ran true, because a David Brown gearbox was the thing the whole reputation rested on. The castings came through from the foundries, the heavy iron of the engine blocks and the transmission housings, sand cast and cleaned and machined. The engines were built up on the benches and then taken to the test cells, where every single one was run and run hard before it would be passed, the bark of the exhausts echoing through the building so that you could stand outside the cell and know, by ear, whether the unit inside was healthy. The great presses shaped the bonnets and the bodywork, the crash of them setting up the baseline rhythm that the whole works moved to. And then came the part that every old Meltham man remembers, the part that turned a machine into an icon. The paint. Orchid white for the bonnet and the bodywork. Poppy red for the wheels and the mechanical parts beneath. It is one of the most beautiful liveries ever put on a working machine, and it was beloved. The white and red David Brown became as much a part of the British rural landscape as a dry stone wall or a chapel on a hillside. There is a story about how the firm came to its earlier red, and whether it's gospel or legend hardly matters, because it's true to the man. When the arguments broke out over what colour the tractors should be, David Brown is said to have pulled off his own red hunting jacket, thrown it over a machine and said, "Paint it that colour." An industrialist settling a design committee with the coat off his own back. Pure David Brown. The machines that wore those colours became legends in their own right. After the war, the VAK-1 gave way to improved models, and then, in 1947, to a tractor that the works christened the Cropmaster, and the Cropmaster made David Brown's name across the world. In just 7 years, almost 60,000 of them were built. For a generation of British farmers, the Cropmaster simply was the tractor, reliable, well-geared, honestly made, a machine you could hand to your son and trust. Through the 1950s, the range broadened in every direction. There was the little 2D row crop machine, built for the market gardener and the smallholder. There were the economy models, the 25 and the 30, for the farmer counting every shilling. There was the 6-cylinder 50D, built big for the wide farms of the New World and the export markets that David Brown was already chasing hard. The firm could build small or large, cheap or powerful, for the hill farm or the prairie. And in 1955, David Brown reached across the Pennines and bought Harrison, McGregor and Guest of Lee in Lancashire, makers of Albion Farm implements, so that the firm could sell a farmer not just the tractor, but the things he hung off the back of it. From that day, the company badge carried both the white rose of Yorkshire and the red rose of Lancashire, side by side. A small heraldic detail. But it told you that this was a firm rooted in something, in a place, in a history, in a pride of region you could not buy and could not fake. Chapter 6. The Single Lever. The defining machine arrived in October 1965, and it was called the Selectamatic. To the eye, it was the familiar white and red. But underneath sat a piece of genuine cleverness, a hydraulic system controlled by a single lever, where rival tractors needed a fistful of separate controls. Pull that one lever through its positions and the tractor would lift, lower, hold and respond to the load, all from one hand. It drew directly on everything the firm knew best. Deep, patient mastery of gears and hydraulics, the inheritance of 100 years of cutting metal in Huddersfield. The smallest of the range, the 770, came with a 12-speed gearbox as standard, 12 speeds, on a tractor a small farmer could actually afford. Only a gear company would have thought it worth doing. Only a gear company could have done it so well. There were 3 machines at the heart of it, the 770, the 880 and the 990. And the 990 became the most popular David Brown ever built, more than 40,000 of one variant alone, at one point accounting for half of everything Meltham produced. Across all its forms, more than 67,000 of that family of machines rolled out of the valley. These were not show ponies. They were working tractors, bought by working men, and they earned their owners' loyalty the hard way, by starting on a cold morning and pulling all day. These were the years the works was at its absolute best, and at its best it was a world the men inside it would remember in complete detail for the rest of their lives. The smell of cutting oil and hot metal that met you at the gate, the din of the machine shops, the rhythmic crash of the presses, the bark of the test cells, the way the whole building seemed to hum at a single pitch when everything was running, and above all the particular quiet pride of a man who could look at a finished tractor in Orchid white and know which part of it had passed through his own hands. The gear he'd cut, the engine he'd built, the seam he'd welded. On a Friday, the wage packet, earned, solid, the foundation a family and a whole village were built on. Because Meltham was not just a place where men worked, it was the reason the place existed at all. Chapter 7. The Village. The Tractors Built. Meltham was a small town, perhaps 8,000 souls, and it lived and breathed by the works. This was not a factory that happened to sit near a community. This was a community that had organized itself, generation by generation, around a single set of gates. Fathers brought sons in. A lad would leave school and start his apprenticeship at Meltham as his father had, and very often as his grandfather had before that. Learning the trade from older hands, who'd learned it from older hands still, that unbroken Yorkshire chain of skill, passed down on the shop floor, the only place it could ever truly be taught. You did not learn to cut a gear from a book. You learned it standing next to a man who'd cut 10,000 of them, watching his hands, listening to him, until one day your own hands knew. That kind of knowledge is the most fragile thing a country owns, because it lives only in living men, and it can only be passed forward while there is a works for it to be passed forward in. The wages from that works built the lives of the town, the houses, the front rooms, the Sunday clothes, the modest week at the seaside, the small securities that a steady wage makes possible and that nothing else can. The pubs of an evening filled with men who'd spent the day at the same benches, still talking shop over a pint. The clubs and the social life of the valley turned in the end on the rhythm of the shifts and the sound of that hooter. And it was not only men. In the war years, as it had been across the whole of British industry, the women of the valley had come into the works to take the places of the men who'd gone to fight, and they had done the skilled work and done it well. Another generation finding out what their own hands could do. The trade unions had their place too. The engineering unions whose shop stewards walked the floor, part of the settled fabric of a great works, the structure through which a skilled man's worth was reckoned and his grievances heard. None of this was unusual for its time. That is rather the point. Meltham was an ordinary, decent, working industrial community at its best, the kind that built modern Britain and is now so largely gone. David Brown understood the place he'd planted himself in. He lived nearby, at a house called Durker Roods, up on the edge of the moor. He kept the firm's character intact through good years and lean, the family name on the gate, the family standards on the floor. The men knew whose works it was, and the man, for his part, knew whose hands actually built his tractors. The names of some of those men come down to us, and they deserve to be spoken because the work was theirs. The men in the field test department who took the new machines out and ran them hard over rough ground before they had let a single one go to a customer. The draftsmen at the design drawing office at Scar Bottom, men like Eddie Herbert and Eric Turner and Malcolm Clegg and Mike Brogan, bent over their boards, drawing the next machine into existence, line by patient line. People with families, with allotments, with firm opinions about the cricket. The works gave them more than a wage. It gave them a place in the world, a thing to be good at, a reason to walk through those gates each morning with their heads up. That is what was truly at stake at Meltham. Not an abstraction, not a line in a corporate report drawn up in another country. A village, and the men and women who made it what it was. Chapter 8. Third in the Kingdom. By the late 1960s, David Brown tractors had climbed to a position that would have seemed impossible to the boy who'd cycled 6 miles to his apprenticeship. It was the third largest tractor manufacturer in Britain, behind only the giants Ford and Massey Ferguson, and ahead of much of the rest of the world. The reach of the place is best measured not in its own valley, but in the fields of distant countries. David Brown sold its machines through 2,508 agents in 100 nations and exported 80% of everything that Meltham built. A tractor finished in Orchid white and poppy red on a Tuesday in the home valley might be breaking ground in Australia or Argentina, or on the African veld within the season. There were 10 subsidiaries scattered across the globe to keep that trade flowing. The White Rose and the Red Rose travelled further than David Brown's own ancestors could ever have dreamed of. The honours came as the reach grew. The Queen's Award to Industry for Export Achievement in 1966, and again later. The official recognition that this Yorkshire firm was earning its country hard currency in markets the world over, at a time when the nation needed every pound it could get, and the engineering kept on leading. When David Brown introduced the Hydra Shift semi-automatic transmission in the 1212 in 1971, it won a Design Council Award, the first such award ever given in the entire history of the thing to a farm tractor. A gear company true to itself to the very last, being honoured for the quality of a gearbox. In 1977, the 500,000th David Brown tractor came off the line, and the firm sent it to feature in the celebrations for the Queen's Silver Jubilee. 500,000 machines. The household name of rural Britain, the pride of Yorkshire, exported to 100 lands, garlanded with royal awards, its founder knighted in 1968 for what he had built. From the outside, in those years, David Brown tractors looked unassailable. It looked like exactly the kind of thing that lasts forever. A great works, a great name, a great region's pride made solid in white and red steel. And that, of course, is precisely the moment to be most afraid. Chapter 9. The most modern plant in the world. The summit had a date and a building, to chase the export markets even harder, and above all, to crack America, the richest tractor market on earth. Sir David Brown resolved to build the finest tractor plant anywhere on the planet. Around 1971 at Meltham, the firm raised a vast new assembly hall. They called it, without much modesty and with a good deal of justice, the most modern tractor plant in the world. It was the physical expression of total confidence, a company at the very top of its game, betting everything on being bigger still. You do not build a thing like that unless you are certain the future is going to be larger than the past. But a building like that is not raised out of profits alone. It was financed on an overdraft from Lloyd's Bank, an overdraft that ran, in time, to something in the region of £30 million, an enormous sum, then or now. The kind of borrowing a company takes on only when it is sure that the orders will keep climbing, and the markets will keep opening, and the good years will simply go on. Standing in that gleaming new hall in 1971, with the Hydra Shift winning its design award, and the export agents working in 100 countries and the 500,000th machine not far off, a David Brown man could be forgiven for believing that nothing on earth could touch them. The firm had survived the loss of Ferguson. It had survived the Luftwaffe. It had built the engine of James Bond's Aston Martin and the gears of the Spitfire and the steering of the Churchill tank and a tractor that filled half the fields of Britain. What was there left to fear? There was one thing. It had nothing to do with tractors and nothing to do with Yorkshire, and not a soul in that new assembly hall could see it coming. Far to the south, another great British engineering name was about to fall, and when it fell, it would pull the very ground out from under Meltham. The most modern tractor plant in the world had been built on borrowed money, and the bank that lent it was about to become very, very frightened indeed. The summit was 1971. The fall began the moment the firm reached it. Chapter 10. The engine that fell on Yorkshire. The thing that killed David Brown tractors did not begin in a tractor factory. It began in an aero engine. In 1971, Rolls-Royce, the greatest name in British engineering, a byword the world over for things that did not fail, collapsed into receivership. It had been ruined by the costs of developing a new jet engine, the RB211, a magnificent piece of machinery that ran catastrophically over budget before it ever earned a penny. The most trusted engineering company in the country went bankrupt. The shock of it ran through the whole of British industry like a crack through ice, and it ran, specifically and fatally, through Lloyd's Bank, because Lloyd's had lent heavily to Rolls-Royce, and now Lloyd's had lost a great deal of money, and a bank that has just lost a great deal of money does one thing above all others. It gets frightened. It looks again hard at everyone else it is lent to. And among the engineering customers on its books, with an overdraft of around £30 million, sat the David Brown Corporation. A man who was there understood exactly what happened next. Tom Lazenby, a senior David Brown figure, set it down plainly years later. When Lloyd's lost those large sums on the Rolls-Royce affair, he recalled, they took a hard look at all their other engineering-based customers. The David Brown overdraft was around £30 million, and the bank called it in. On demand. On demand. 3 words that decided everything. Sir David negotiated a way out for the short term. He was a formidable man, and he bought a little time. But as Lazenby put it, it was obvious that something had to go. Hold the cruelty of this in your mind for a moment. The tractor division was not the problem. The tractor division was the jewel. Profitable, world-beating, exporting 80% of its output, the 3rd largest in Britain. The wider David Brown Corporation had other divisions that lost money, and the glamorous Aston Martin cars had always lost money. But the bank's panic was not about whether a business was good, it was about getting its £30 million back. And the surest way to raise £30 million quickly was to sell the most valuable thing you owned. The most valuable thing David Brown owned was the tractors. There was a deeper trap too, and the managing director Jack Thompson named it. The firm had known for some time that the magnificent new plant could only be justified if the company got bigger, that some kind of merger was essential to make the sums work. Sir David, knighted in 1968 and well-connected, had lobbied the government for what Thompson called a political solution. He even explored taking over the Nuffield tractor operation that sat inside British Leyland, the idea being to build a British champion big enough to stand up to the multinationals. He approached the powerful, including, it said, his fellow Huddersfield man, the Prime Minister Harold Wilson. It needed political clout to make it happen, Thompson remembered. That clout was not forthcoming. So the British solution died in Whitehall. The government would not build the champion. The bank would not wait. And the only buyers on earth with £30 million to spend on a tractor company, ready to move quickly, were not in Britain at all. They were in Houston, Texas, and they already owned a tractor company of their own. Chapter 11. The word they used was merger. In February 1972, with the corporation cornered and the bank's demand hanging over everything, the board forced Sir David Brown to sell. Forced. The board overruled the man whose name was on the gate, whose grandfather had founded the firm in 1860, who had built the whole empire with his own restless hands. The tractor division, the crown jewel, the profitable heart of it all, was to be sold to an American conglomerate called Teneco, and in the same dreadful year, Aston Martin Lagonda was let go separately to a different buyer for a nominal sum. In 1972, David Brown lost both of the things his initials stood for, the tractors and the cars, the fields and the fantasy. In a single year, the man surrendered the lot. The The deal was reported complete by the New York Times on the 8th of July 1972, in a dispatch sent from London the day before. The David Brown Corporation, it stated, a major British engineering group, had sold its tractor manufacturing interests to Teneco of Houston for more than $33 million. More than $33 million. A profitable, world-leading, 100-year-old Yorkshire enterprise reduced to a line in an American newspaper and a figure on a contract. Who, exactly, were Teneco? It is worth knowing, because the Yorkshiremen who were about to spend the rest of their working lives employed by them barely did. Teneco was a sprawling Houston conglomerate, grown enormous and rich on the back of a natural gas pipeline business that traced its roots to the war years. It had been built up by a hard-driving American executive named Henry Gardner Simons, who had run it with an iron hand until his death in the summer of 1971, just months before the deal. By 1972, its chairman and chief executive was a man called Dick Freeman. To Teneco, David Brown was not a treasure. It was an acquisition, one-line item among dozens, a few $100 million transaction in the affairs of a conglomerate that dealt in pipelines and chemicals and land. And crucially, this is the hinge of everything that followed, the fact that contained the entire tragedy folded up inside it. Teneco already owned a tractor maker. It held a controlling stake in J.I. Case, of Racine, Wisconsin, acquired some years before. Case was a direct competitor to David Brown, a rival, 3,500 miles away. So this was the truth of the thing, laid bare in a single sentence. A beloved, profitable, world-leading British tractor company had been sold, against its founder's will, by a frightened bank's deadline to an American conglomerate that already owned a rival tractor company. The logic of what comes next is written into that sentence so plainly that reading it now, you wonder how anyone failed to see it. When a company owns two competing tractor brands, it does not, in the long run, keep both. But the men at Meltham were not given that sentence. They were given a different one entirely. They were told it was a merger, not a takeover, not an absorption, not the sale of a jewel to a rival, an affiliation, a partnership of equals, full of promise, in which the great American parent would respect the Yorkshire heritage it had bought, invest in the most modern tractor plant in the world, and carry the David Brown name to markets the family firm could never have reached alone. A rosy future, secure jobs. That was the prospectus, and it was repeated up and down the valley. And the British executives, and it seems Sir David himself, who wanted to believe the thing he had built would be cherished, appear to have taken it largely at face value. They believed the Americans had bought a treasure, and that men who buy treasures look after them. It is the most human mistake in the whole story. And then there occurred one of the strangest, most haunting accidents in the entire history of British industry. The company newspaper was called Tractor News. In the spring of 1973, it carried the reassuring merger story on its front page, full of the promises of security, the bright tomorrow, the careful, soothing prose of men trying to keep a workforce calm. But by sheer ill chance of layout, that same front page also carried the banner headline of a completely unrelated article. The piece had been written by a young trainee named Alan Earnshaw, and it was about a disused railway line. The headline above it read 3 words: End of the line. It had nothing whatever to do with the merger. It was about old railways, branch lines closed and lifted, the sort of gentle local history piece a trainee writes. But there it sat, in bold black type, directly above the news that the firm had been sold to America. And the men reading it on the shop floor, many of whom would glance at a headline and never trouble with the careful, reassuring article beneath, saw only those 4 words hanging over the announcement of the sale: End of the line. They took it to mean the works was closing. They were wrong about the cause, and they were the better part of 2 decades too early. But about the destination, they were not wrong at all. How prophetic, one of them later wrote, looking back, it all turned out to be. An accident of typesetting had told the truth that the prose was written to conceal. Chapter 12. The Men with Stopwatches. At first, nothing terrible happened. That is how these things always work. The catastrophe does not arrive in a single afternoon, with a slammed door and a notice on the gate. It arrives slowly, in reasonable-looking steps, each one defensible on its own terms, each one easy to absorb, until one day, years on, You look up and find that everything you had has gone, and you cannot quite point to the moment it left. The first change the Meltham men noticed was small and almost comic, and, looking back through everything that came after, entirely ominous. It was the men with stopwatches. As one former apprentice engineer recorded, in the memoir that preserves so much of this story from the inside, things soon began to change after the sale, and one of the very first was the flood of time and motion men who appeared in various departments, upsetting a fair few of the workers in the process. Picture what that meant in that particular place. Here was a works built, from its foundations on trust, on David Brown's own lifelong creed of getting a good man and letting him get on with it. And now it was filling up with strangers holding clipboards and stopwatches, standing at a man's shoulder, measuring to the second how long a Yorkshire engineer took to do the job he'd done well for 30 years. The whole philosophy of the place was being quietly turned inside out. The men knew it. They didn't yet have the words for what was happening to them, but they felt the cold coming in under the door, and within about a year of the sale, the truth that the accidental headline had foretold began to show itself in earnest. It was announced that David Brown was to be merged, really merged this time, not in the soothing sense of the prospectus, with that other Teneco asset, J.I. Case, the American rival, the thing the Houston conglomerate had owned all along, sitting 3,500 miles away in Wisconsin. And once two tractor companies sit inside one owner, a process begins that has only one possible end. The owner does not want two of everything. It does not want two ranges of broadly similar tractors competing for the same buyers. It does not want two liveries, two dealer networks, two badges, two names. The logic of consolidation is patient, and it is utterly without malice, and it is therefore impossible to argue with. It does not hate Meltham. It does not love Meltham. It simply does sums, and the sums, in the end, did not need a works at the bottom of a Pennine Valley and a works beside a Wisconsin railroad, both doing the same job. The men of Meltham were now working, though most of them, getting on with the day, did not yet truly grasp it, for an organization that would one day, by the cool arithmetic of consolidation, decide they were surplus to requirements. And the first sign of that decision, the first of 3 deliberate, dateable blows, did not come for their jobs. Not yet. It came, first, for the thing they loved most about the tractors they built. It came for the colour. Chapter 13. The first blow. They took the colour. In 1973, the year after the sale, a unified colour scheme was agreed across the group to bring the David Brown machines into line with their new American stablemate, and in 1974, the change reached the metal. The beloved chocolate brown castings, the rich dark colour the Meltham men had mixed and applied for years, part of the very recipe of a David Brown tractor, were done away with. They were replaced with Case Power Red. On the face of it, this is a small thing. A colour, a shade of paint on the lower workings of a tractor. For now, the Orchid white tin work survived, so to a casual eye in a distant field the machines still looked broadly like the David Browns they had always been. And you could argue, Tenneco's people certainly would have argued, that it was nothing more than tidy corporate sense for the tractors in one group to share a family appearance. A reasonable decision. They were all reasonable decisions. That was always the horror of it. But a livery is never only a colour, and the men at Meltham understood that in their bones. That white and red, that exact palette settled, so the story goes, by a man throwing his own red hunting jacket over a machine and saying, "Paint it that colour," was the visual soul of the mark. It was the thing that made a David Brown at a glance, across a field, at distance, to a child who couldn't yet read the badge. And now an American firm, 3,500 miles away, had reached down into the home valley and altered it, not for any reason of engineering, not because the new colour lasted better or covered cleaner, but simply to make the Yorkshire tractor look more like an American one. This was the first quiet erasure, the beginning of the long, patient process by which a thing made in Meltham would be made, layer by layer, to look as though it had been made by somebody else, somewhere else entirely. The men kept building. The tractors were still as good as they had ever been, the gearboxes, still the best in the business, the engineering still honest. But the machines coming off the line were, drop by drop, year by year, becoming a little less their own. The Case name began to creep onto the bonnet, too, through the middle and later 1970s, though at first quietly, often half hidden, tucked away or obscured behind a loader bracket or a fitting, present but not yet shouting. A name learning the shape of a space it fully intended, in time, to own outright. And the men noticed. Of course they noticed. They were not fools, and it was their tractor. But a man with a mortgage and a family and 20 or 30 years in does not down tools over a coat of paint. He grumbles about it in the pub of an evening. He says it isn't right, that they're spoiling a good machine, that nobody in Texas knows the first thing about a Yorkshire tractor. And then he goes back in through the gates the next morning and builds another one, because that is what working men do, and because the only alternative explanation for what he was seeing, the explanation that this was the slow beginning of the end of everything, was in the mid-1970s, still far too large and too terrible a thing to let yourself believe. Chapter 14. The Second Blow. They took the name. The decisive insult came in 1983 with the 94 series. For a decade, the David Brown name had still been there, fading on the bonnet, perhaps, with case decals creeping in alongside it, sharing a space it should never have had to share. But there, the name of the founder, the name on the gate, the name that meant something in 100 countries, and it was there, too, cast into the engine block itself, raised in the very metal where no marketing decision could easily reach it. But on the 94 series tractors, the name was, at last, taken off the bodywork altogether and replaced with case decals. Gone from the bonnet, gone from the place where the customer and the world would see it. The David Brown name, the name of the man who had bought Aston Martin and built the gears of the Spitfire, the name that had filled the fields of 100 nations and earned the Queen's Award twice over, was deleted from the very tractors that the David Brown men were still, with their own hands, in their own valley, building every single day. It survived only where the eye was not meant to go, raised in the casting of the engine block, readable only by a man who knew it was there and went looking, a ghost in the metal. But on the part of the machine that faced the world, the name of David Brown was gone. Think for a moment about what that does to a man on the floor. You are still at the same bench you have stood at for 30 years. You are still cutting the same superb gears, still building a machine to the same exacting Yorkshire standard your father held to before you. Your skill has not changed. Your pride in it has not changed. But the thing you now hand to the customer at the end of it no longer carries your name. It carries the name of an American company you have never seen, in a town you could not point to on a map. To the men who built them, a tractor that no longer said David Brown was, in a real and wounding way, no longer truly theirs. It was just work now, just a machine with somebody else's name on it, made by hands that were no longer being credited for the making. There was even a smaller indignity folded into the same change. The 94 series castings, which had been power red, were now switched again, this time to black. The official reason was sound and modern enough. New government legislation on the lead chromate content of paint and the considerable cost of upgrading the works paint plant to comply with it. A defensible decision, like all the others. But some of the men, watching their tractors turn from white and red to red and black to plain sombre, dark, suspected a humbler and less flattering motive underneath the legislation. Black, after all, hides an oil leak rather better than red does. Whatever the truth of the paint, the meaning of the deleted name was beyond any dispute. The Americans had stripped the British soul out of the machine and left the working body behind to keep producing. The brand had been hollowed out from the inside while still walking around, and a brand whose own owner has quietly removed its name from its own products is a brand that owner has already, somewhere in its accounts and its plans, decided it does not really need to keep. The third blow was now only a matter of time, and the time was being counted out, not in the home valley, not in any boardroom in Britain, but on a map of England, spread on a desk, in an office in the United States. Chapter 15. The Third Blow. A look at the map. At the end of 1984, Teneco made the purchase that sealed Meltham's fate, and the man at the head of the conglomerate by then was no longer Dick Freeman, but James L. Kettleson, and his presence at the top is part of the tragedy, because Kettleson had himself been the president of J.I. Case before rising to run the whole of Teneco from Houston. The fate of the Yorkshire works now rested with a man whose own career had been built inside its American rival. What Teneco bought, at the end of 1984, was the agricultural business of International Harvester, one of the truly great names of American farm machinery, a giant in its own right. And it merged that business into J.I. Case to create a vast new combined enterprise. They called it Case IH. Overnight, Tenneco's tractor arm became one of the largest on Earth, and the International Harvester purchase came with a British factory attached, a plant at Doncaster, in Yorkshire, barely an hour's drive from Meltham. Now the patient, merciless arithmetic of consolidation had every single thing it needed. Teneco owned 2 tractor factories in the same corner of the same English county, and it did not want 2. One of them would build the group's tractors for the British and European market. One of them would close. There was no third option, and there was never going to be one. And the decision over which would be made, inevitably, by people who had never once walked the floor at Meltham, never smelled the cutting oil hanging in the machine shops, never stood and watched the white and red machines coming off the line in the most modern tractor plant in the world. The apprentice engineer who left us the memoir saw the whole thing coming with terrible, helpless clarity. They knew, he wrote, that when someone in America looked at a map, they would see the International Harvester plant at Doncaster as practically next door to Meltham. The 2 works would look, from Houston, like duplication, like waste. Many of the men felt, in his words, that the writing was on the wall, and their fears were entirely well-founded, because within a very short time, many of the apprentice-trained engineers had lost their jobs, including, he wrote simply, myself. Doncaster carried one decisive advantage, and in the cruelest twist of the whole story, it was an advantage that had nothing to do with tractors at all. It was about lorries. Doncaster sat squarely on the motorway network. Easy access, easy haulage in and out. The kind of logistics that a planner in Houston looking at that map could understand and approve of at a glance. Meltham sat at the bottom of a winding, wooded Pennine valley, down narrow roads, in the very seclusion that had once been its salvation. And there is the bitterest irony in a story already full of them. The remoteness of the valley, the deep, hidden, hard-to-reach fold of land that had shielded Meltham from the Luftwaffe's bombers in 1941, that had let Lord Haw declare it destroyed when it was humming away safe beneath the trees. That same remoteness now counted heavily against it. The thing that had once saved the works from German bombs now helped to condemn it before American accountants. The valley could hide Meltham from an enemy in the sky. It could not hide it from a road atlas on a desk in Texas. There was a fight. The records are clear about that, and it matters, because it would be wrong to let the men go down as people who simply accepted their fate. There were, by the accounts, many ardent attempts by the staff of the old company, and by politicians at both local and senior level, to save the works. The constituency that held Meltham was Colne Valley, and from June of 1987 its Member of Parliament was Graham Riddick. People tried, but the numbers employed dwindled steadily, relentlessly away, not in one dramatic announcement, but decision by decision, redundancy by redundancy, a slow bleeding out of a workforce. And the order of the work itself, in those last years, told the whole story of the surrender without a word needing to be said. The final 2 models built at Meltham were Case Internationals, the 1394 and the 1594. The very name cast and badged on the last machines the Yorkshire works produced was an American one. The factory that David Brown had built was running out its final years assembling tractors that did not, anywhere a customer could see, carry the name of the family that had built the place, the valley, and the village around it. Chapter 16. The Last Tractor. The end, when it finally came, was quiet. The end of a great works almost always is. There is no explosion, no single dramatic catastrophe to point to. There is just a last day, like the thousands of ordinary days before it, and then a silence afterwards, in a shape that should not be there. The last David Brown tractor rolled off the Meltham assembly line on the 11th of March, 1988. It was a 1594, built to American specification. And we know more than that, because some things are too important to be allowed to slip away without a record. We know its serial number. 154 BJB. 528785. A string of figures that means nothing to anyone, and everything to the men who watched it go. The very last machines off the line were badged as commemorative and, in a small, aching act of remembrance on the way out the door, they carried the DB initials, David Brown's own initials, on the bonnet side panels. After the name had been stripped from the bodywork in 1983, after 5 years of building tractors that bore another company's name, somebody saw fit to put those two letters back on, just for the end. DB. The name returning to the machine at the very last moment, exactly in time to leave the building forever. The men who built that final tractor had, many of them, been building David Browns for the whole of their working lives. Their fathers had built them before them. The hooter that sounded over the valley on the morning of the 11th of March was the same hooter that had sounded over their fathers walking down to the gates, and their grandfathers before that. And now, the line that all those generations had served was stopping. The chain of hands, unbroken since 1939, was being set down for good. Limited production of spare parts struggled on for a few months afterwards, because the David Brown tractors still working out in the world's fields, in Yorkshire and Argentina and Australia, and 100 places between, still needed feeding with the parts to keep them running. But the works as a living thing, as a place where something was made, was finished. The making was over, and then came the auction. In October 1988, over 2 days, the contents of the 78-acre Meltham site were put under the hammer and sold off. Andy Armour of the David Brown Tractor Club set down the bare, brutal facts of it, that the plant had continued its limited production of spares right up until it was finally auctioned over those 2 days, with 2,500 lots being offered. 2,500 lots, and among them, this is the figure that stops you, 800 machine tools. 800 machine tools. The actual instruments of the craft. The lathes, the gear cutters, the grinders, the presses, the very machines upon which 128 years of accumulated Yorkshire skill had been practiced, day in and day out. The tools that had cut the gears for the Spitfire's engine. The tools that had built the heart of the most famous car in the world. The tools that had turned out the white and red tractors that filled the fields of 100 nations. All of it, knocked down lot by lot, under an auctioneer's gavel, to whoever happened to have the money in the room that day, and then carried off in lorries to wherever those buyers came from. Dispersed, scattered to the four winds, the physical body of the works, broken up and sold for parts, in the very halls where it had stood and worked and made things the world wanted. The 78-acre site that had employed around 3,800 people at its peak. Some who knew the place well put the figure nearer 4,000. Closed at the last with the loss of around 700 jobs. The numbers are dry, the way numbers always are. They sit on the page and they do not bleed. But behind every one of those 700 was a man, and behind every man a household, a wife, children, a mortgage, a place in a community that had been organised around these gates for half a century. Behind the figure was a Pennine village losing, all at once and forever, the single thing it had been built around, the thing its men had given their entire working lives to, the thing that had made Meltham Meltham, and not just another small town in a fold of the hills. A respected British name had been erased. The most modern tractor plant in the world fell silent, and in the wooded valley that had once hidden it from the bombers, there was now nothing left to hide. Chapter 17. After the hooter stopped. When the works that built a town finally closes, the men who worked it do not simply disappear. They scatter, and the David Brown men scattered, after 1988, across the whole of the working world. Some of them managed to stay in engineering, finding berths in other firms while there were still other firms to find, carrying their Meltham training, their gear cutter's eye and their fitter's hands into whatever work would have them. But many could not. Many drifted, of necessity, into trades that had nothing whatever to do with the skill of their lifetimes. The record tells us, plainly and almost unbearably, that former Meltham men ended up in totally unrelated trades, from hat makers to booksellers to insurance agents, men who had once machined a gear to within 1,000th of an inch, who could feel by hand when a tolerance was right, found themselves selling policies, or books, or hats. The training of a working life, set aside because there was no longer anywhere to use it. And this is the loss that never appears in any redundancy figure, the loss the 700 number cannot hold. The skill itself died, not because anyone set out to kill it, Nobody in Houston ever decided to destroy the gear-cutting tradition of the home valley. But because the skill could only ever live and be passed on inside a working shop, master to apprentice, hand to hand, and the working shop was gone. When the works went, the chain of hands went with it. The thing that had taken 128 years to build up, that lived only in living men standing at living benches, simply stopped being passed forward. It does not transfer to a hat shop. It does not survive in an insurance office. It just, quietly, ends. The town itself, perhaps 8,000 people, absorbed the blow the way such towns have always had to absorb such blows, by enduring it. The defining employer was gone. The steady weekly wages that had built the front rooms and bought the Sunday clothes and paid for the modest weeks at the seaside were gone with it. Meltham went on, because places do go on. But it went on now as a town that had lost the very reason it had become the particular place it was, a body that had lost its heart and had to learn to live differently. And what of the works itself, the great stone mills standing in the wooded valley? It is still there. The site lives on today as the Meltham Mills Industrial Estate, a scattering of small businesses now occupying the buildings where one single great enterprise had once filled every floor and every yard. Over the years, it has held, among other things, an indoor kart track, which has itself since closed. And in a closing of the historical circle so neat that no writer would dare invent it, a textile manufacturer named Camera now makes upholstery fabric on part of the old site, returning the place, after everything, to the cloth-making that the Brooke family had carried on there before David Brown's tractors had ever arrived. On the old mill offices, if you go and look, you can still find the Brooke family's goat's head crest carved into the stone. The valley has, in its way, gone almost all the way back to the beginning. Durka Rood's, Sir David's old home on the edge of the moor, became a hotel, and that too has now closed its doors, its grounds sold off for housing. And the old test track, where generations of new tractors were once run hard over rough ground before they would be let out into the world, is now the Meltham Greenway, a quiet path for walkers and cyclists laid along the bed of the old branch railway line. The very line, as it happens, that the young trainee Alan Earnshaw had been writing about all those years before, beneath those 4 accidental prophetic words. As for Sir David Brown himself, the boy born inside the walls of Park Works, the man who had built the whole empire and bought Aston Martin and lost both in the single ruinous year of 1972, he had long since gone. After the warship division of his old corporation was nationalised, he left Britain in 1977 for Monte Carlo. He sold the last of his David Brown Corporation shares in January 1990 for £46 million, and he died in Monte Carlo in 1993, an exile from the Yorkshire county he had made famous across the world, dying 2 years, as it turned out, before the last tractor he never built would find its way home to the men who still remembered. Chapter 18. What the Valley Keeps. There is a postscript to all of this, and it matters, because it is the part where the men, in a small way, got something back. That very last tractor, the 1594 of the 11th of March, 1988, serial number and all, was shipped across the Atlantic to the Case Museum in Wisconsin, in America. And there, in the country that had bought the firm and quietly taken it apart, it sat. For something like 15 years, it stood outside, in the open air, accumulating in all that long time, perhaps 20 hours of use. The final machine of a 128-year-old Yorkshire enterprise, left out in the American weather like an object nobody could quite work out what to do with, too significant to scrap, not significant enough to its owners to bring in out of the rain. But it came home. In the end, Case IH repatriated it and gave it to the David Brown Tractor Club, and now it stands under cover, looked after, cherished, in the place where it belongs. The exile returned at last, for the David Brown Tractor Club keeps the flame burning. It runs a museum in the former factory's J block, Unit J2 of the industrial estate, which sits, with a fittingness that feels almost deliberate, right alongside the very building where tractor production first began back in 1939. The story ends a few yards from where it started. Men like Roger Brereton and Peter Murray and Andy Armour have given years of their lives to keeping it all. The records, the machines, the memory. The club marked 30 years in 2025. And out across the country, the tractors themselves endure, Sought after, restored, loved, the white and red Selectamatics still turning out for shows and road runs, still earning their keep on small farms, immortalised too in miniature by Britons and Dinky, the little toy 990s that a whole generation of children once pushed across kitchen floors and that collectors now seek out. The name even survives in earnest, in industry, to this very day. Because the gear business, the original business, the 1860 business, the wooden patterns and the machine-cut gears that the first David Brown made his name on, never died at all. It carried on. It changed hands over the years, passed out of and then back into British ownership, and it trades now as David Brown Santasalo, still in Huddersfield, still cutting heavy transmissions, including in a line that runs straight back to the Churchill and the Centurion for the Challenger 2 tank. The boy who learned to drive on a soapbox seat with blocks bolted to the pedals would understand that perfectly. The tractors were lost. The gears go on. But the tractors are the heart of this story, and the truth of the tractors is a hard one to sit with. David Brown Tractors was not destroyed by a bad product. The machines were superb to the very last day. The gearboxes the best in the business, right up until the line stopped. It was not destroyed by any failure of skill, for the men were as good as any engineers in the world, and they proved it every morning. It was not destroyed by laziness, or complacency, or decline. It was destroyed in the end by a single signature, forced by a frightened bank in the wake of an entirely different company's failure, onto a contract that sent a profitable, beloved, world-leading Yorkshire treasure into the hands of people 3,500 miles away who already owned its rival. People who, when at last they looked at a map of England, would always, in the end, choose the factory beside the motorway over the one hidden down in the valley. They took the colour, then they took the name. And then, having stripped away everything that made it theirs, they took the works. Stand today on the Meltham Greenway, on the bed of that old railway, on a still afternoon when there's no one much about. The valley is quiet. The woods that once hid the works from the German bombers have crept a little closer to the old stone buildings over the years, softening their edges, taking the place slowly back. And if you happen to know what once happened here, the 500,000 Merlin gears, the steering of the Churchill tanks, the engine of the most famous car in the world, built a few yards from tractors bound for 100 countries, the hooter sounding out across the terraced streets, the men walking down through the gates each morning with their heads held up, then the quiet has a particular weight to it. It is not an empty silence. It is a silence in the wrong shape, the shape of a sound that used to be there and isn't anymore. A village built a thing that led the world, and the world took it away.